She leaned her head back and stared. The building shook with an increasingly loud series of explosions. Chapter 19. The Army Marches. Let us turn the clock back a little. Jinchi was in a rocking, jolting carriage, sitting across from a man who looked sour. However, perhaps carriage wasn't entirely accurate. This was more like a house on wheels pulled by 10 horses. An animal pelt covered the floor, and a table stood in the middle of the cabin. Lacan, a man well known for his unrelenting smirk, was now glaring at a map with evident annoyance. Behind him, his adopted son was studying Lacan's and Jinchi's expressions. He was also tucking a receipt into the folds of his robe. This man, Lahan, was the second most tight-fisted person Jinchi had ever met. The madam of the Verdigris house was the first, but on this occasion he was more than happy to acknowledge that Lahan had saved his neck. He felt like he might be attacked at any moment. Liu Humen's intervention had successfully soothed the worst of Lacan's rage, but it still smouldered. Gaoshan attended behind Jinchi, prepared to draw the sword at his hip at a moment's notice. Raising a hand against Jinchi carried that kind of risk, but Lacan probably didn't care at the moment. Jinchi suspected he would have been just as happy to jump on top of him and beat him senseless. The man was simply that worried. Lahan was proving a helpful check on him. Father, I ask purely hypothetically, but if a man were to do violence to a member of the imperial family, would the crime fall on him alone? It was a roundabout question, to be sure, but it was enough to keep Lacan from doing anything rash. To attack Jinchi would be the end of a person's family. Even Lacan's daughter Maomao would not be spared. Lacan was not easy to fool, and he knew exactly who Jinchi was. That is why he had asked him to mobilize the army. He suspected Lahan had guessed the truth as well. When he asked why, he received the most La Clan-ish of answers. The answer was that his height, weight, chest and torso were all the exact same number. Such people are very rare. As always, Lahan's way of looking at things was difficult for others to understand. You are terribly lovely, he added. It is only a shame you were not born a woman. That gave Maomao gooseflesh. Her cousin looked and acted much like she did, but unfortunately Jinchi did not feel that way. Still, he knew talent when he saw it. He had obtained special permission for this civil official to accompany him on this military expedition. Today, Jinchi was not the eunuch Jinchi. His hair was held in place by a silver hair stick. He wore armor and a bluish-purple helmet, instead of his usual black official's outfit, with thick cotton underpadding. Lacan said, I hope he can distinguish victory and defeat better than we can distinguish whether he is a man or a woman. He was correct about one thing. The time had come for Jinchi to shed his eunuch skin. They were leading an army and trying to coordinate several plans at once. Are you quite sure about this? Jinchi asked. There won't be any problems, Lahan assured him. The map before them showed a stronghold with mountains at its back. The map was older, as the fortress hadn't been used in quite some time. They had found soldiers who had once been stationed there to update it and make sure it was as accurate as possible. Lahan believed that firearms were being produced in that stronghold. The northern reaches had plenty of timber. Many people wished desperately to control the place, hoping to capitalize on its lumber resources, but the Shi clan defended it stoutly. There were hot springs nearby, and these were an excellent source of sulfur, but one more ingredient would be necessary to create fire powder. What would they do about saltpeter? Small animals like to hibernate in the area, perhaps because of the hot springs. There are large caves nearby. That suggested there were substantial quantities of bat guano present. It would be possible to create saltpeter from the excrement. Jinchi grunted. If the defenders had firearms, they were unlikely to bring individual Fafer to bear on an attacking force. No, they would have something on the stronghold walls designed to ravage an advancing enemy all at once. Cannons would be the real danger, but if Jinchi could think of it, he could be confident that Lacan was already well aware of the possibility. To him, the map probably looked like nothing more than a go-board. He pointed to the cliffside behind the stronghold. Lahan said firmly, it is theoretically possible to overpower them before they can use their cannons. Lacan said, bopping his adopted son on the head, you heard Abacus brain. The fire powder necessary to make a cannon work easily got wet. Powder could be kept near the guns at all times. However, if it was, it would be in an armory to keep it dry. The stronghold was at a high altitude, and snow fell there frequently. Scouts reported that this very night, the snow was coming down heavily. If Jinshi's forces simply advanced on the stronghold, they would be easy targets. So it was Lakan's suggestion to take out the powder depot. He wanted to deny the enemy the use of their cannons. The way he came up with to do it was bizarre. It was bizarre but possible. That was what made him so fearsome. Lakan said he thought it would be a very economical way to handle things. It was likely just one word, economical, that had convinced him to support the plan. In the short time they had spent together, Jinshi felt he understood how the man thought very well. We must force our way inside and find Maomao. Daddy will save her. Jinshi tried not to grimace when he heard the word daddy. He couldn't let anyone see him making faces. He bit his lip as he considered the small young woman. Had she been taken as a hostage, or was there another reason for her predicament? Had she gone along of her own free will? Whatever the reason, she was now in the enemy camp, and he wanted to rescue her as soon as possible. Jinshi clenched his fist. We will do that, he declared. Wait one moment, please, said Gaoshun. He furrowed his brow and knelt before him. I see a problem. What kind of problem? Lakan and Lahan looked as perplexed as Jinshi. Have my good lords forgotten the nature of this army? They were leading a force large enough to handle a stronghold of this size. If they followed Lakan's plan, they could expect virtually no casualties. Are you suggesting that the forbidden army would stoop to an ambush? Jinshi swallowed heavily and reached up to touch the hair stick on his head. It was sculpted in the shape of a killin, a symbol of the imperial family. He had spent so long as a eunuch that sometimes he felt he was at risk of forgetting his true identity. At this moment, however, he was not Jinshi. Considering who he was, he should subdue the enemy boldly and openly. He understood all of this, yet the words that came from his mouth betrayed him. I agree with the Grand Commandant. Understood, sir, Gaoshun said, and obediently stepped back. His eyes were on the man behind him. His piercing gaze made the hair on the back of Jinshi's neck stand up. Most excellent. I'm not interested in making a drinking cup out of my own skull, Lakan said. He snorted and exited the carriage, passing the curtain. They weren't moving terribly fast, but it was still a jump. Jinshi thought Lakan looked as if he crumpled slightly when he hit the ground. Was he okay? Lahan was working his abacus furiously, making sure there were no mistakes in the calculations. Jinshi's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Getsu, it was Gaoshun calling him by his true name. The crease in his brow seemed deeper. You are going to have to change how you interact with the young lady after this. He sounded as if he were admonishing a child. I know. Jinshi sighed deeply, his breath fogging in the cold air. He shivered and pulled his white hooded cloak up over his head. It was just past midnight when he heard the explosions. Wondering what was going on, Shishu got up. He grabbed the sword he always kept by his bed. He had been in bed, but he hadn't been able to sleep. The court might regard him as the old tanuki, but even he had little things that kept him up at night. Indeed, how could he possibly sleep? For a decade and more now he had tried and had found it impossible. He heard shouting in the next room. There was perhaps some surprise at the noise, but it soon quieted. The voices of the women enjoying themselves returned to their usual burble. Just one wall away, his wife must have been enjoying her wine. She seemed to revel in leading the clan women into lewdness, cavorting with paid men. This is how she had behaved almost every day since their daughter Lulan had been born, being sure to lose herself in pleasure where Shishu would know it. The women with her had been reluctant at first, but by now they enjoyed these diversions. His wife consistently chose women who were already married and who had borne children, fulfilling all their familial duties. She found pleasure in seeing these virtuous wives become debauched. She hadn't always been this way. Shishu went out onto his balcony and looked into the distance. An enemy attack, he thought. The lights of the army were still far away, perhaps the forbidden army. From this stronghold on its high perch it was possible to see many li into the distance. He still had time to catch a few winks. Then Shishu scrunched up his nose. There was a strange smell in the air. Was that sulphur? They were making fire powder in the basement. Had it exploded, of course. He tightened his collar. He had to do something, he thought, but he did not move. It was pathetic, but the strength simply wouldn't come to him. The cunning old tanuki, favored by the empress regnant, and whom even the reigning monarch could barely look in the eye, that was not who Shishu was at this moment. He recognized it himself. His stomach had started to protrude abruptly and dramatically after his 40th birthday. He proceeded forward one step after the next. To get outside and find out what was going on, he would have to pass through his wife's room. That caused him more pain than anything else. The woman given to him by the former emperor, or rather, his betrothed, the one he had waited 20 years to have returned, had developed a prickly nature during her time in the rear palace. When she finally returned to Shishu, he already had a wife and a child named Suhari. He had not intended to marry someone else. Even the woman who became his wife likely did not want this. She was born in the rear palace and then banished as an illegitimate child. Her father was none other than the former emperor. It had been the former sovereign's wish. A request came when his health suddenly began to decline 20 years ago. He had said, "Please care for my child." Shishu's wife came to have not only thorns but poison. He had to do something, and he had to do it quickly. He kept repeating this to himself, and finally he managed to open the door. The male prostitutes looked startled. The women, with their remaining modesty, quickly covered themselves with the sheets. His wife lay on a couch, taking a long drag from her pipe. Her eyes were sharp and full of contempt. "What was that noise?" she said, speaking slowly as purple smoke drifted from her mouth. Shishu was just about to tell her he was going to find out when the door to the hallway flew open. Lulan stood there, covered in soot. "What are you doing here in such a pathetic state?" Shishu's wife said. "You're the last person who has any right to ask me that." Lulan shot back, giving a pointed look to the women fighting over the covers. "All of you who abandoned your children so you could lose yourselves in a life of excess." One of the women, shocked back into remembering her own child by Lulan's words, tried to flee the room, but Lulan slapped her across the cheek. The woman fell to the ground. The male prostitutes ran away, understanding how desperate things were. Shishu could hardly believe what he was seeing. It was his own daughter. He had always thought his Lulan was a prim and obedient child. She wore the outfits her mother told her to wear, as if she were a little doll. Meanwhile, Lulan walked into the room and slid open the doors of the wardrobes that stood against the wall. When she opened the largest one, she found a young woman squeezed inside. "My dear sister. I am sorry, it took me a little longer than I intended." The trembling young woman was bound hand and foot. She was being disciplined. She closely resembled Lulan. She was Shishu's other daughter, Suhari. Lulan freed Suhari, rubbing her back gently. It was obvious from how smoothly and easily she did everything that this had happened before. Or the second. Shishu felt his stomach plummet when he realized how profoundly he had failed. Then Lulan turned and looked at her father, Shishu. She smiled at him. "Father, at least take responsibility here in these last moments." He did not have time to ask for responsibility for what, for she continued, "You are the old tanuki, the transforming trickster of the fox village. Let's play our parts to the very end." There was another roar, and this time the entire stronghold shook. Shishu grabbed onto the wall for support. He worked his way back to the balcony to find out what had happened this time. He saw flakes of snow floating everywhere. Everything to the east of the stronghold was completely white, and he could not see anything. At first he did not understand what had happened. As the haze of snow began to clear, he saw it. The building that should have been there was buried. The armory, as he recalled it, it was now half inundated with snow. As he stared stupidly, Lulan said, "You should have known this was an opponent you could never beat. Please take responsibility." She added that she would deal with her mother. Then his daughter, her slightly scorched hair bobbing, walked over to her mother. She looked downright regal as she stood before her. "Take responsibility," his daughter had said. Shishu clenched his fist, resolved. Chapter 20, The Ambush. These guys had to be crazy, Lahaku thought. In front of him, Shishu's private troops cowered, overwhelmed by the intruders. They had grabbed spears in a hurry when the attackers appeared, but they were no match for Lahaku and his men. Lahaku and his men had prepared thoroughly. Lahaku was here to take the treacherous Shi clan into custody. It had to be treason. How else were they supposed to interpret the rebuilding of an abandoned fortress 60 li north of the capital? The presence of actual soldiers meant it was as good as open rebellion. Despite the size of the stronghold, to plot rebellion with nothing but this was the height of foolishness. Shishu, the leader of the Shi clan, was a person of considerable influence at court. He held so much sway over the emperor that he had been able to chase out a former high consort and install his own daughter in her place. Lihaku tilted his head in puzzlement as he swung his club. Had Shishu become mad with greed, or simply mad? Even if he felt cornered, disappearing from the capital and hiding in a place like this was almost an invitation to be treated as a rebel. Lihaku wondered if the man known throughout court as the old tanuki would truly do something so foolish, but in any case, Lihaku was a military official. He could leave the pondering to others. He simply had to do his job. He brought his club down on an enemy soldier's foot, then swept the man's legs out from under him. Behind him, subordinates in white cloaks tied up the overpowered enemies. Lihaku had been wearing a white cloak, similar to theirs. He tossed it off a few minutes ago because it kept getting in the way. Blood spatter showed up quite conspicuously on white fabric. It wasn't really an appropriate garment to wear into battle. However, the white cloak did allow them to blend in with the snow. Perfect for hiding in plain sight, especially on a moonless night. Lihaku and his troops advanced without torches. The squadron had split into two as they approached the fortress. One unit was the forward infantry, full of men who knew how to handle themselves in the snow and were confident of their abilities. The second group was several li back. It went something like this. The stronghold guards noticed the lights of the rear group, but completely missed the closer unit creeping forward in the dark. They believed the enemy was much farther away than they were. Lihaku and his troops had a problem too, though. They had to cross an open field for several li. It would have been easier with some stars visible, but the sky was completely black. This made it all too easy to lose their sense of direction. Lihaku finished tying up an enemy and let out a breath. Something dropped from his collar. Neat idea, these things, he remarked, picking up the fish-shaped wooden object where it had fallen in the snow. It would allow him to ascertain the location of the fortress. The little fish contained a magnet. If you put it in a bucket of water, it would help you determine which direction you were going. It was a common tool on ships. The surface of the fish had been dusted with strange glowing particles. This allowed it to be read even in the dark of night. The particles supposedly came from a mushroom that glowed in the dark. There was another aspect to the ambush as well. Lihaku looked at the avalanche that had come down from the cliffside with no small amazement. Whoever came up with this plan must have been crazy like a fox. This was one reason this stronghold had been abandoned. Areas near hot springs tended to experience a lot of earthquakes. There had been a major landslide a few decades before, large enough to alter the local geography. It had shaved off part of the mountain, and now avalanches sometimes occurred during winter. These avalanches weren't large and they weren't very frequent, but it wasn't a promising feature for a defensive position. This particular avalanche just happened to be human-made. The weather was colder than usual this year, and the snow was very deep. Several of the most experienced mountaineers in the vanguard had moved off, carrying fire lances. Lihaku had wondered why, and now he understood. He was crunching his way over the filthy snow when he spotted someone entering the fortress. A man stood out, his white cloak and long black hair appearing lovely in the night. Lihaku had never expected to think of any man as lovely, let alone in the middle of a battle. He smiled wryly to himself. One would never have expected to see this man on the battlefield at all. He had flawless features. He was the groundskeeper of the garden behind the palace, and some would say he was one of its flowers. But with him, the word flower could mean something else entirely. It might refer to the meaning of the name Ka. The man's hair was partially tied up and held in place with a silver hair stick. Anyone who saw the design would have fallen to the ground. The name of their country, Li, was written by repeating the character for sword 3 times. Above those swords was a symbol meaning grass or flower. In the whole country there were only 2 people with the name Ka, and he was one of them. He should not have been here, not usually. He really shouldn't have been on a night march, walking several li in complete silence. Even this group of men, chosen specifically for their physical strength, were showing the strain by the end. But that man with a face as beautiful and delicate as a celestial nymph, clutched a willow leaf saber. He wore bluish-purple armor to indicate his status to those around him. It was the eunuch Jinchi who stood there, in what should have been a man's position. The young eunuch enjoyed the emperor's favor. He was so handsome that unsavory rumors sometimes began to circulate. More than a few people likely gaped when he stepped forward to take command. Several officials had gone positively pale. The young master was popular with both men and women. In fact, even men sometimes tried to impress him. Lihaku had been as surprised as anyone. Recently, Gaeshun, who always served closely with Jinchi, had made a series of requests of him.